Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to go over with you the climactic passage in Matthew's Gospel where the risen Christ dramatically appears to his remaining disciples and announces who he is and commissions them to go and make disciples of all nations. This text is critical for understanding the full picture of what discipleship means in Matthew's gospel, and in particular, its connection to the person of Christ and to the mission of God. Let's have a look at this familiar passage and to see what it can teach us then about discipleship and mission and what it really looks like to be followers of Jesus Christ. Our text opens in verse 16 with this way. The 12 disciples went to Galilee to the mountain which Jesus had commanded them to go to. If you go back to the beginning of chapter 28, Jesus first appears to the women and he tells them to go and tell the disciples to meet him in Galilee. Let's note a couple of things here that are important right off the bat. Notice immediately the links between discipleship and obedience. This is going to be a critical role. We've already seen this. It's the idea that what does it mean to follow Jesus? It means to be to imitate Jesus, to obey. And we're going to see that phrase, obedience, be emphasized in this text. The risen Christ appeared to women, and now he tells the disciples actually to travel to Galilee. So part of being being a disciple means being obedient to Jesus' word. We're going to see it also means then passing that obedience on to the next generation of Christ followers. So the first thing we see here is his disciples are obedient. And notice a couple things, though. There's some warnings that are implicit here. Did you notice the number that was used? It didn't say the 12 disciples. It said the 11 disciples. Right? Who's missing? Judas, of course. If we go back to the initial listing of the 12 in chapter 10, in the missionary discourse where Jesus sends out his disciples, we have that list of 12 disciples with the phrase, Judas, the one who betrayed him. And so now Judas is gone, but that omission is critical here because we have 11 disciples, not 12. So there's a little bit of warning that's implicit here about making sure that Jesus' disciples stay obedient to Jesus' words. Now, when they also go to Galilee, and what's the significance of Galilee? Well, if you recall, if we go back to the beginning of Matthew's gospel, at the end of chapter 4, or near the end of chapter 4, we know that Jesus withdrew into Galilee, and we had that connection there in chapter 4 back to the prophecies from Isaiah about Galilee of the Gentiles and how the Messiah was going to be here. And I mentioned in class that Galilee was the region of eschatological fulfillment. It's from Galilee that Jesus began his ministry, and now it comes full circle, and Jesus is going to give the Great Commission, which is going to send then God's people, not just to Jews, but also to all nations, to the Gentiles. So Galilee is pivotal in the book of Matthew, so it's significant that Jesus gives this Great Commission from Galilee. And so the disciples go there in obedience. And so the disciples go to the mountain, and notice verse 17. So they've gone to meet Jesus in obedience to his word, but then we get a little picture about something else that's built in with this discipleship. Listen to verse 17. And seeing him, they worshiped, but some doubted. Now that seems kind of crazy, right? That we have worship and doubt. But notice this, that part of being a disciple is a combination of worship and some element of doubt that's built in here. Now, this isn't the first place that we've seen either of these words within the context of Matthew's gospel. Now, when we talk about worship, we first encountered a person's worshiping Jesus back in chapter 2 when the Magi came. And if you recall, their response when they discovered the baby Jesus in Bethlehem as they followed that star is they worshiped Jesus. And if you also recall, they brought gifts and things with him. And so worship is a couple of things here. It's a recognition of who Jesus is, and it's also a submission to his person out of recognizing who Jesus is. And as you recall, that's what the response of the Magi had been. Now, I also want to show you another context quickly in Matthew where worship and doubt come together, because we have this as a little bit of a contrast here. We have doubt comes in. Now, there's another context in Matthew. Remember, when we're trying to interpret passages, it's always critical as kind of a first level is we want to make sure there are other places in the context where we see these words. So we've already referred worship back to how the Magi responded. But we also, if you look in Matthew chapter 14, there's a critical text that gives us some clarity on this as well. Listen to Matthew 14, verses 28 to 33. And this is the context where Jesus is walking on water, and you recall that Peter wants to get out of the boat. And so verse 28, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You have little faith. Why did you doubt? So again, here's Peter. Remember this mixture here. He wants to get out of the boat. He trusts in Jesus and he gets out of the boat, but then he sinks. So he has this combination of both faith and doubt. Yet Jesus still saves him, and that's going to be a critical part. But then continue on here. So we see the word doubt in verse 31 of chapter 14. Then verse 32, and when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Again, as we've seen in Matthew's gospel, that's precisely who Jesus is. He's the Son of God. Peter's going to make that broader confession in chapter 16, verses 13 and 20. That confession is made by the centurions when Jesus dies on the cross. And here it is here as well. And so chapter 14 gives us this combination where you see both doubt and worship. Again, the disciples in 14, they recognize Jesus as the Son of God, and they worship him despite Peter's doubt. Now, did you also hear that other phrase that's recurred a couple of times in Matthew that showed up in chapter 14? It was that whole issue of you of little faith, right? We saw that in 6:30, where Jesus is talking about trusting in the provisions that God gives. We also saw it in chapter 8, verse 26, where the disciples again are in a boat and they think they're going to die, and Jesus saves them in that context as well. So notice that being a disciple doesn't mean we're going to always have 100% certainty. This is critical because oftentimes in our life we can be frozen because we as humans, we have deep need for certainty. What Matthew's trying to teach us this is that authentic worship of God, deep faith in God, doesn't mean the absence on occasion of some doubt and some uncertainty about what all these things mean or what to make of it. Again, because it's kind of almost astonishing. Here they are in front of the risen Christ. They're worshiping him, yet some of them are still doubting. That's an important word for us because we live almost 2,000 years after the events in Matthew's gospel. And if the very first disciples who were there for the whole ministry, the death, the resurrection, ultimately go and take the gospel to all nations, if when they encountered the risen Christ, there was an element of doubt, we need to be a little easier on ourselves sometimes. Okay, what else does it say? Notice again that discipleship, this is a theme we've seen in Matthew's gospel, comes at the initiation of Jesus. Verse 18. And going to them, Jesus goes to them, right? They came to Galilee at Jesus' invitation, right? So they showed their obedience. But now Jesus is actually coming to them and is going to call them to something deeper. The disciples don't commission themselves. Jesus commissions them for mission. Jesus spoke to them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And comes at the fulfillment of Jesus' promises. So we have this invitation of Jesus linked to Jesus' promises, and it's rooted in what? All authority. Why can Jesus commission the disciples? Because all authority has been given to him. Again, notice that passive language there. Who gave Jesus the authority? It's God. We've seen that consistent in Matthew's gospel where it talks about it was revealed not by flesh and blood, or we've seen language like even the kingdom of heaven. Here again, God is spoken of passively, but it's clear that Jesus has received all authority. And what does all mean in Greek? It means all, right? So Jesus has this comprehensive authority on heaven and on earth. Think back to the Lord's Prayer. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Jesus, in this proclamation of the kingdom, all authority between heaven and on earth has been given to King Jesus. And now Jesus is going to commission his disciples. And verse 19 carries the words of this famous commission. And you may not know this, and this is where it's important to know a little Greek and to learn a little Greek. In verse 19, we have, "Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit." And then verse 20, "and teaching them to keep and to obey everything that I commanded you. And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age," right? And so when we look at the commission, it's critical to recognize what the main verb is in this verse. Because there's only one. That main verb is make disciples. So if we asked you, what's the mission of the church according to Matthew, it's make disciples. This is the mission that Jesus gives his disciples. And I want to note a couple of things here. The other three verbs, go, baptize, and teach, are all participles in Greek. And what that means then, participles are verbs that are subordinate to a main verb. And so a participle, these phrases, go, make disciples, baptizing, and teaching, give us some understanding of what it means to make disciples. Now, the first participle, go, is a circumstantial participle that reminds us of a critical thing that we've seen in Matthew's gospel. I use the phrase that one of my mentors, Alex McManus, always says, the gospel comes to us on its way to someone else. We noted that the typical response to Jesus in Matthew's gospel is to follow him, right? And so the idea is that Jesus leads his disciples, trains his disciples to be part of a movement, To be part of the church has never been a static thing where you stay, and Jesus models this movement throughout his ministry. And so it's critical that we capture this. It's the idea, what does it mean to make disciples? It's we need to go and make disciples. This isn't necessarily saying you have to go far away, but it's a reminder that Jesus creates a movement. It's a movement toward people who are desperate for the things that only God can provide. It's not a withdrawal from the world, it's an engagement with the world. The church is a movement, and it's a movement that mission is to make disciples. So how is it that we make disciples? Well, Matthew, in Jesus' words, gives us a couple of participles, and these are essentially the participles that give us the means or the mode of discipleship, and it involves essentially two tasks. Now recognize that discipleship is a circular movement. It's not just for what happens after you follow Jesus Christ. It's the whole process from the first time that the gospel's articulated all the way through continuing to teach persons who are already following Jesus what it means to be a disciple. So discipleship is for everyone, not just for the church. And it involves baptizing. And remember, this is a rite of initiation. So all the things that are involved with baptism are implicit here, including actually reaching out, winning, and then bringing people into the community. So it's an initiation rite and all the things that go along with it. And then it also involves teaching. Now, this is a word that we've only so far heard in relationship to Jesus, going all the way back to the Sermon on the Mount, or as we said in class, the teaching on the Mount, because Jesus doesn't preach, he teaches, right? So far in Matthew, only Jesus has been the teacher. Now that the disciples have seen the risen Christ, Jesus adds teaching to their plate. And what does the teaching involve? The teaching involves the instruction that Jesus has already given. And so the teaching element isn't just about facts, it's transformative actions, practices, habits. All the things that Jesus did and taught in the Gospel of Matthew are now to be passed along to the next set of disciples. Why? So that they can then engage in this commission. So this is teaching that's mission-centric and community holding together. Go back to chapter 18 and look at some of the themes that are there. Look at the Sermon on the Mount. This is to create a missional community that ultimately reflects the ethic of the kingdom of heaven. That's what this teaching is about. And so this is the process. We could talk about it in terms of sanctification, but it's really missional instruction. So this gives us the language if we want to talk about missional, holy living in community. All that is implicit in the way that Jesus taught in Matthew's gospel. Discipleship comes at the initiation of Jesus, and discipleship is characterized by actually discipling. So when we see this language and this great commission, it invites us then to go back and look at all those texts in Matthew and to read Matthew's gospel as a manual for discipleship, right? And so what are some of the themes that we've seen? Think about the challenges. Jesus' kingdom initiating, signifying actions. Jesus broke down boundaries to go and reach persons who are outside traditional religion, right? Jesus' openness to outsiders, even the way Matthew records the responses of the Magi in contrast to Herod and Jerusalem with him. How Jesus goes and heals lepers, a centurion's servant. He healed Peter's mother-in-law. All the boundary-breaking activities that Jesus does. Jesus taught his disciples to go, right? Realign yourselves continually and follow me. Matthew 16:24 talked about disciples being willing to actually lose their very lives, to not hold on to life, to do the will of God and to follow Jesus into the world on mission. Matthew chapter 18 talked about the necessity of holding community together and the practices of forgiveness and reconciliation within the Christ following community. And we can go and say more things, but the entire Gospel of Matthew is coming to this climactic point with the idea, again, that discipleship involves disciples. We do that, we become disciples by actually discipling. The gospel comes to us on its way to someone else. And then lastly, and this is the important guarantee, how does the gospel end? It's a reminder that discipleship also involves the continual or the continued presence of Jesus Christ. Behold, or lo, I am with you always. Not sometimes, until the end of the age. Specifically when the church is involved in mission. Recall how the gospel started. Jesus' name was going to be Emmanuel, which is God with us, back in chapter 1. Chapter 18, when the church was working in reconciliation, it says where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in their midst. And now with this inclusio, the gospel ends with a reminder that Jesus is with us always. So this is really significant. Jesus is with us as he leads his church into mission in the world. And friends, we just don't want to make this an academic exercise. This is the climax of Matthew's gospel. But as we read this, how can we not respond and ask ourselves, what's my place in God's mission? Who is my mission? Who is God leading me to disciple? How do I understand my church? Is my church just a place where we gather together to worship, or is the church that I'm part of a missional community that exists to take the gospel to the neighborhood, to our homes, and to the ends of the earth, knowing that the risen Christ leads us there? Again, we could say a lot more. This gives you a little taste of what we have and talks about some of the themes that we've seen in the discipleship of Matthew and how the Great Commission brings this out. If you have any questions, let me know. Again, I'm Brian Russell. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your hard work as we've studied Matthew together this semester.